welcome back. Today I'm going to provide you with an overview of modern philosophy, bringing us up into postmodern philosophy. Now, you've already taken a brief look at Descartes, who's seen as the father of modernity, the father of modern thought. And that's because his methodology provides a pretty firm break from the way philosophy was primarily done, at least in the Western world, up to this point. As a review, you go back to the ancient era, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and they are pursuing the good. They're trying to figure out what the good is. What is it that makes good things good? And then how can I positively relate myself to it? And so with that viewpoint, they're operating from a kind of faith. They're starting with the kind of faith that says, there is a good that I can know, there is a good that I can pursue. There is a reality that exists above and beyond myself that I can conform myself to, and as I do so, I will discover the life of meaning, the life of happiness, as Aristotle would say. And so for Aristotle, happiness is not just something that we create on our own. It's not just whatever happens to please us, but happiness comes from living as we're supposed to live, which is something that we can figure out through the right use of reason and the right practice of virtue. Now, move into the medieval era, and they're doing something very similar. This era is best understood as faith-seeking understanding. And so they're beginning with, again, looking at specifically Western philosophy, they're beginning with a Christian foundation, a Christian context, and then they're trying to use reason, they're trying to, make use of Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics and whatnot in order to get a better handle on, what it means to be human, to get a better understanding of even the Christian faith and how they are to live that out in the world. And so ancient world is pursuing the good, medieval world is faith-seeking understanding. Well, once we get to the modern period, we really have something more like understanding seeking faith. Because what Descartes is going to do is he's not going to begin from a standpoint of faith, of tradition, or of biblical authority, or anything like that. He's going to attempt to begin from a position of absolute doubt. He's going to say, I'm going to kick out everything I could possibly be wrong about until I find something I cannot possibly be wrong about. And that bedrock of his worldview, the thing that he believes he cannot doubt, is that he exists. He must exist in some capacity. Now, for all he knows, that his, every experience of the world could be a delusion, like the Matrix. He could be having the simulation fed into his brain. Maybe the world around him isn't real. Maybe, in fact, his own body isn't real. All the sensations aren't real. But what he does know is that he must exist because he is thinking. I think, therefore I am. Now, that doesn't mean that his thoughts somehow create his existence, but things that don't exist don't think. But if you are thinking, well, that evidence is the fact that you must exist in some capacity, even if you're just a brain in a vat somewhere, or you're just a mind, and everything else is a lie. Everything you've experienced with your senses is a lie. You still must exist because, well, only things that actually exist can be lied to. And so he knows that he exists. And then based off that, he tries to reason his way up to justifying his belief in the world and ultimately his belief in God. And so even though he lands at some pretty traditional conclusions, his beginning point is a pretty radical departure in that he is beginning with himself. He is making reason and not faith his starting point. And that's going to directly lead us into where the modern period is going to go. And ultimately, I think it's going to open the door to the postmodern period. But before we get to the postmodern period, the modern period is really pursuing certainty. And so we have pursuing the good in the ancient era, we have faith-seeking understanding in the medieval era, and now in the modern era, we have the pursuit of certainty. And Descartes finds this in the belief that he exists. Now, the next major philosopher in the modern era is David Hume. Now, like Descartes, David Hume is looking for certainty, but he doesn't go with the highly rational approach of Descartes. Hume is an empiricist. An empiricist are going to prioritize sense experience. And so, for Hume, the only thing you can know with absolute certainty is that you are perceiving certain things at any given moment. And so I don't know that there is this camera and this computer and this microphone in front of me. What I do know is that I perceive them. That, at least in my mind, I have these impressions of these things. Now, do these things actually exist in the world beyond my thoughts, beyond my perception? I don't know. That's not something I can ever know for certain. What I do know is that I perceive that they exist. And for Hume, that is the only thing we can know with absolute certainty, that we are perceiving things at a given moment. Now, what this means is that a lot of beliefs that we tend to take for granted are going to be off the table for Hume. For example, the idea that I have a soul that continues to exist across time. That I can meaningfully talk about who I was 5 years ago, who I am today, and who I will be 5 years from now. That idea that we all have, that there is a continuous existence to our lives, well, we don't actually experience that anywhere. That's just an idea that we bring to bear on our present perception of memories, which may or may not have happened, right? We just have these perceptions of memories, as well as my anticipation of the future. But even once we get to the future, at that point, who I am right now is nothing more than an impression on my mind. And so the idea that there is a me that pervades across time is not something we get from our sense experience. Therefore, according to Hume, it's not actually legitimate knowledge because it's not something we can know with certainty. All I can know with certainty is that I am perceiving things that are right in front of me. Now, the next major philosopher in the modern period is going to be the German Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is largely going to agree with Hume. However, Kant really wants to save this idea that we live in a shared world, that we don't just have our own individualistic, hypersubjective sense experience, but that we actually share a reality that we can talk about meaningfully. And what this is going to do is allow us to save the idea of science. Because unless we have an objective world that we can study that exists beyond our sense perception, well, then we can't meaningfully engage in science, which is a pursuit of an understanding of the world as it is, not just the world as I perceive it. And the way that he at least gets close to doing this, to recovering an objective shared reality, is by noticing that, okay, yes, we can only be certain of our sense experiences. However, we all seem to experience the world in more or less the same way. And so if we run an experiment right here in Virginia, and somebody runs a similar experiment with all the same variables, somewhere else in China or Australia or wherever, and then we compare notes, we're going to come to find that we've all more or less had the same sense perceptions. And so because we are all oriented toward the world in more or less the same way, because we have a similar nature that allows us to interpret the world in a similar way, well, we may never be able to talk about the world as it exists. We can at least talk about the world as it exists in our shared sense experience. And so Kant is still largely an empiricist, but he believes that he's recovered a sense of a shared reality that we can meaningfully talk about. And this is at least as close as we can get to talking about an objective reality as it is. Although we will never actually know the world as it exists beyond human sense perception. We'll never have that kind of divine perspective. Now, of course, there are many other important philosophers in the modern period, but those three, René Descartes, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, are probably the three most foundational thinkers for the modern period. Now, as we jump forward to what will be known as the early postmodern period, we get figures like Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is very important, and Nietzsche looked back on the modern period, beginning with Descartes, and he recognized that most of the major modern thinkers are going to give some kind of lip service to the idea of God. However, again, beginning with Descartes, God didn't serve really any foundational role in modern philosophy, at least in these major thinkers. He was more of a conclusion rather than a starting point. But here's the thing, Nietzsche recognized this. And by the way, Nietzsche was a pastor's kid. His father was a Lutheran minister. And Nietzsche recognized that if God is not at the foundation of your philosophy, God being the source of truth, well then you're not really talking about God in any meaningful sense if God is simply your conclusion rather than your starting point. And so Nietzsche, when he famously said, God is dead, he didn't mean that God used to be alive and then he died. He wasn't trying to argue that atheism is true. Basically, what he said was, we haven't been making use of God in a really meaningful sense for a long time. Let's just strive to be more consistent with that. And so, as you're going to see in his parable of the madman, he actually doesn't look to the so-called death of God with the same kind of glee that you might get from somebody on Twitter or your YouTube atheist commenter. He actually is kind of terrified because he recognizes that if there is no God, there is no absolute transcendent authority on what is true and on what is good, then everything is up for grabs. There's no direction as to where we should go. And again, that's not the kind of freedom that you might be inclined to think it is right away. Because what it means is, no matter where you go, which direction you take, everything is going to be artificial. It's going to be man-made. It's going to be a bridge from nowhere to nowhere, hovering over nothing. And so his prescription is, okay, all you really can do is go forward and create your own values. And so do that with strength and do it with intentionality. And that leads us to another of our philosophers that you will be looking at this week. And that is Jean-Paul Sartre, or as it's usually pronounced in America, Sartre. And so Sartre is going to have a very Nietzschean orientation to him. And what he's going to say is that there are no Platonic forms. There's no transcendent good that you can know, that you can pursue. He's going to say that all that exists is you. Actually, even that's not right, because even you don't really exist as a stable reality for Sartre, because you are constantly determining what your nature is through the decisions that you make. And so all there is for Sartre is your willingness to create yourself through deciding what your reality is going to be. And if you don't do that intentionally, then he believes that you still are, in fact, deciding what your reality is going to be, but you're not being authentic about it. You're not being intentional about it. You're not being honest with yourself about what it is that you are doing. So Sartre is a major figure in the postmodern school of thought called secular existentialism. However, don't think that all existentialists or all postmoderns are necessarily secular, or they all necessarily are atheists. In fact, the figure who's usually referred to as the father of existentialism is the Danish Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And so this week, I'm having you read Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman, so you get a sense of where postmodernism tends to look for its foundations. I'm having you read Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, so you get a sense of secular existentialism, which is an important strain of thought in postmodernism. And I'm also having you read Søren Kierkegaard's To Need God is a Human Being's Highest Perfection, in which he does have a fairly subjectivist orientation. However, he believes that true human purpose is found in an impassioned relationship with God. And so, on one hand, he is going to absolutely disagree with Nietzsche, he's going to disagree with Sartre, but he's also going to launch some attacks against the cold Christendom of his day, the Danish state church. He's going to argue that real, vibrant faith, something of the heart, is necessary in order to finding our meaning, finding our legitimate place in existence. And so we get some competing worldviews that I think will all come together to give you a decent taste of what the postmodern era of thought is like. I really hope that you get something out of the readings this week in your own quest for authentic existence. And I look forward to seeing your thoughts. And until next time, Godspeed.